September 16th, 1935. Late Tuesday night at the Cotton Club in Harlem. Bumpy Johnson sits in a back room surrounded by 8 white gangsters. They work for Dutch Schultz, the most violent mobster in New York. This is supposed to be a business meeting, but everyone knows it's really about one thing: making Bumpy submit. Then it happens. A guy named Joey Rao, drunk and cocky, slaps Bumpy across the face. Hard, right there in front of everyone. For a moment, nobody moves. Nobody breathes. Bumpy stands up slowly. His cheek is red. Blood trickles from his lip. He looks at Rao and says quietly, "You've got 47 minutes. Then he walks out. What happened next would change organized crime in America forever. This is that story. Understanding Harlem in 1935 before we get into the violence, you need to understand what Harlem was like back then. On the surface, it was amazing. This was the Harlem Renaissance. Duke Ellington played jazz at the Cotton Club. Writers and artists made it the cultural center of Black America. People came from all over to experience the music, the energy, the life. But underneath all that beauty was a completely different world. The numbers racket controlled everything. Think of it like an illegal lottery. Regular people would bet nickels and dimes on 3-digit numbers. If your number hit, a quarter could win you $150. That's huge money when most folks were making $15 a week during the Great Depression. Here's the thing though, for years this was Black people's business. Black entrepreneurs ran the numbers game. They employed hundreds of people from the neighborhood. The money stayed in Harlem. It was one of the few ways Black folks could build real wealth in 1930s America. But by 1935, white gangsters wanted in. And they weren't asking nicely. Dutch Schultz comes to Harlem. Dutch Schultz, his real name was Arthur Flegenheimer, was terrifying. He'd made millions from bootlegging during Prohibition. Now that alcohol was legal again, he needed new ways to make money. And he looked at Harlem like it was a gold mine ready to be taken. Since 1931, Schultz had been basically invading Harlem. His men would beat up numbers runners. They'd destroy gambling operations. They'd kill anyone who didn't cooperate. Over 40 people died in 4 years. Most Harlem operators eventually gave in. They had to. Fighting Schultz meant fighting the entire Italian and Jewish mob. You couldn't win that war. But one woman refused to back down. Madame Stephanie St. Clair. St. Clair was brilliant. She'd come from the Caribbean and built the biggest numbers operation in Harlem. She was educated, sophisticated, and absolutely would not submit to white gangsters trying to steal her business. And she had a secret weapon, her chief enforcer, Bumpy Johnson. Who was Bumpy Johnson? Let's talk about Bumpy, because understanding him is key to understanding this whole story. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born in Charleston, South Carolina on Halloween 1905. He got the nickname Bumpy because of a bump on the back of his head from a childhood injury. When he was 10, his family had to flee South Carolina in the middle of the night. His older brother was accused of killing a white man. Didn't matter if it was true or not. In 1915 South Carolina, just the accusation could get your whole family lynched. They came to Harlem with nothing. Bumpy watched his mother work herself nearly to death cleaning white people's homes for almost no money. He watched police harass Black men for just standing on corners. He learned early, in America, nobody gives Black men respect. You have to take it. By his teens, Bumpy was running with gangsters, but he wasn't your typical street thug. He was smart, like really smart. He read constantly, studied strategy, understood how people thought, and he was willing to do what needed to be done. One story from when he was 17, a rival gangster threatened his boss. So Bumpy walked into the guys' club in front of 20 people and beat him unconscious with a lead pipe. Nobody pressed charges. Everyone got the message. By his 20s, Bumpy had a reputation as the most dangerous enforcer in Harlem. But unlike most muscle-for-hire, he thought before he acted. He understood that random violence made you look weak. But precise violence applied at exactly the right moment. That was power. In 1932, Stephanie sent. Claire hired him to protect her operations from Dutch Schultz's invasion. For 3 years, Bumpy did exactly that. He protected her runners. He fought off Schultz's men. He survived 3 assassination attempts. By September 1935, at 30 years old, Bumpy Johnson was already a legend in Harlem. But Dutch Schultz didn't believe in respecting black gangsters, and that belief was about to cost him everything. The meeting at the Cotton Club, September 16, 1935, around 11:30 p.m. The meeting was supposed to be about coordination. Gangster talk for Schultz, telling Bumpy how things were going to work now that he was in charge. It was set up at the Cotton Club, which was neutral territory. Bumpy was told to come alone. He knew it was a trap. Of course it was. But refusing to show up would make him look scared. And in the gangster world, showing fear is suicide. So Bumpy walked in wearing his best suit, knowing he might not walk back out. Inside, 8 of Schultz's men were waiting. Not Schultz himself. He was too smart to do his own dirty work. But his top enforcers were all there. Joey Rao, Lulu Rosenkrantz, Abe Landau, all killers, all armed, all smiling like they'd already won. They offered Bumpy a drink, made small talk. Then they started explaining how things would work now. They used words like cooperation and partnership, but what they really meant was, "You work for us now, boy." Bumpy just listened. His face showed nothing. Then Joey Rao made his fatal mistake. The slap Rao had been drinking. He'd been talking for 10 minutes, explaining to Bumpy how the real world worked, meaning the world where white gangsters made the rules and black men followed them. Bumpy stayed quiet, totally calm. To someone who didn't know better, he might have looked like he was accepting defeat. Rao mistook this silence for fear. "You understand what I'm telling you," Rao said, leaning forward. "You work for us now. You, that crazy bitch sent. Claire, all you." He started to use a racial slur, but before he finished, his hand shot out and slapped Bumpy across the face. The sound echoed like a gunshot. The whole room went silent. Even Schultz's men knew Rao had crossed a line. You don't put your hands on Bumpy Johnson. Everyone in Harlem knew that. Apparently Joey Rao didn't get the memo. Bumpy's head snapped to the side from the hit. Slowly he turned back to face Rao. His cheek was red. Blood ran from his split lip. But his expression hadn't changed, still completely calm. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost gentle. "You just made a mistake," Rao laughed. "What are you gonna do? You're in a room with 8 of us. You got no crew, no guns, no—" Bumpy stood up, still calm. 47 minutes, he said. "That's how long you have to make peace with whatever God you believe in." Then he walked past all 8 armed men and out the door. Nobody stopped him, because somewhere deep in their guts, they sensed something terrible was about to happen. The response the second Bumpy hit the street, he was moving fast. Not running, Bumpy Johnson never ran, but walking with serious purpose. Within minutes, he'd made 4 phone calls from 4 different locations. He used code words, short messages. Then he disappeared into the network of alleys and basements he knew better than anyone. By midnight, 40 of Bumpy's most loyal men were getting ready across Harlem. They were pulling guns from hidden spots, taking positions on rooftops and street corners, turning the neighborhood into a battlefield. Here's what Joey Rao didn't understand. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just another gangster. In Harlem, he was a symbol. He represented the idea that black men didn't have to accept disrespect from anyone. Not cops, not the government, not white mobsters. By slapping Bumpy, Rao didn't just insult one man. He insulted all of Harlem. And Harlem was about to answer. The ambush at Bumpy's headquarters Stephanie sent. Claire was waiting. She took one look at his face and understood immediately what had happened. "How many?" she asked. "8 in the room. Rao, Rosencrantz, Landau, and 5 others." St. Clair thought for a moment. She knew what Bumpy was planning would escalate everything to the point of no return. But she also knew that not responding, letting this disrespect stand, would destroy everything they'd built. "How many men can you get tonight?" she asked. 42, armed and ready," she nodded slowly. "Then make it count. Send a message so clear that Schultz has no choice but to back off." Over the next 20 minutes, Bumpy put together a military-level operation. These weren't random street thugs. They were organized, disciplined soldiers. Many had fought in World War I and learned real combat tactics. The plan was simple and deadly. Rao and the others would eventually leave the Cotton Club. They'd be armed, but they'd also be overconfident. They thought Bumpy was alone and scared. They thought he'd run and hide. They were completely wrong. Bumpy positioned 3-man teams to cover every exit from the Cotton Club. He put more teams near Schultz's other operations throughout Harlem. Others took spots on rooftops with clear views of the streets below. This wasn't going to be a fair fight. This was going to be an execution. By 12:15 a.m., everyone was in position. Bumpy himself went to a 3rd-floor apartment with a perfect view of the Cotton Club's front door. He had a Thompson submachine gun, a .45 pistol, and the cold patience of a predator. Now he just had to wait. 47 minutes inside the Cotton Club, Joey Rao was celebrating. He was telling everyone who'd listen about how he slapped Bumpy Johnson, and the guy just took it like a coward. But the men who were actually there remembered it differently. They remembered Bumpy's calm, his promise. Those 3 words, 47 minutes. They kept checking their watches. It had been 32 minutes. Lulu Rosencrantz had stopped laughing. He'd been in this business long enough to know when something felt wrong. The street outside looked normal enough. A few people walking, some cars, nothing obviously dangerous. But it was too quiet. And in Harlem on a Tuesday night, too quiet meant trouble. "We should leave," Rosencrantz said. "Right now." Rao waved him off. "You scared?" "Yeah," Rosencrantz said. "I am. And if you had any sense, you would be too." But by the time they finally decided to leave, it was too late. They walked out at 12:39 a.m., 52 minutes after the slap. The street looked empty. Their cars were parked half a block away, just a 60-second walk. Rosencrantz went first, his hand on his gun inside his coat. He was scanning rooftops, doorways, alleys. He saw nothing, but he could feel eyes on him. Lots of eyes. They made it 30 feet before the first shot rang out. The shootout, the first bullet came from a rooftop. A single rifle shot that missed Rao by inches and shattered a window behind him. Then all hell broke loose. From 3 different rooftops, from 2 alleys, from behind parked cars, Bumpy's men opened fire. Not wild, crazy shooting, but aimed, disciplined fire. They were using real military tactics. Some guys laid down covering fire while others moved position, creating overlapping fields of fire. Joey Rao caught 2 bullets in the chest before he even drew his weapon. He dropped to the ground, blood spreading across his white shirt. In his last seconds, he finally understood. Bumpy Johnson had kept his promise. 47 minutes. The street turned into a war zone. Schultz's men fired back, but they were exposed, outnumbered, and completely outmaneuvered. Rosencrantz dragged himself behind a car, shooting blindly at shapes in the darkness. Abe Landau took a round through the shoulder, then another through the leg. The whole firefight lasted less than 90 seconds. When it was over, 3 of Schultz's men were dead or dying. 4 others were wounded. Only Rosencrantz escaped without getting hit, and only because he stopped fighting and started running the second he had an opening. As police sirens started wailing, Bumpy's men disappeared like ghosts. Within minutes, there was no evidence they'd ever been there, just bodies, bullet casings, and blood. The message had been sent. Now the question was, what would Dutch Schultz do? The war escalates September 17, 1935. Morning. The shooting made every newspaper in New York. The tabloids went crazy. Gang war in Harlem. 3 dead in policy racket violence. In the underworld, everyone understood what had really happened. Bumpy Johnson had just declared war on Dutch Schultz. A black gangster had publicly humiliated one of the most powerful white mobsters in America. Both sides were now trapped. If Schultz didn't respond with overwhelming force, he'd look weak. If Bumpy backed down, everything he'd built would collapse. There was only one way this could go: more blood. Over the next week, Harlem became a battlefield. September 18th. 2 of Bumpy's runners got beaten unconscious on 125th Street in broad daylight. That night, one of Schultz's gambling houses burned to the ground. $30,000 in cash and betting slips destroyed. September 19th. Schultz brought in 20 more gunmen from Brooklyn. They drove through Harlem in convoys, intimidating shop owners, roughing up anyone connected to St. Clair or Bumpy. That night, Bumpy's men ambushed one convoy. Another shootout. 2 of Schultz's men wounded, 1 of Bumpy's killed. September 20th, the worst day. A stray bullet from a shootout killed a 12-year-old girl walking home from school. The community exploded with rage. Harlem's ministers, activists, and business leaders publicly demanded both sides stop. The police, embarrassed by the chaos, flooded Harlem with cops. Dozens of low-level guys on both sides got arrested. But here's where Bumpy's genius showed. While Schultz's men, mostly white guys who stuck out in Harlem, kept getting arrested, Bumpy's men blended in perfectly. They had family, friends, hiding places. The community protected them. September 21st. Stephanie St. Clair made a public statement in Harlem's black newspapers. She called Schultz a racist invader and framed the whole conflict as a fight for black economic independence. It was brilliant. Overnight, public opinion shifted. Bumpy and St. Clair weren't just gangsters anymore. They were defenders of Harlem against white exploitation. By September 23rd, 1 week after the slap, both sides had lost men and money. The police were cracking down hard. Nothing was resolved. It was just chaos. But Dutch Schultz wasn't the type to accept a stalemate. On the night of September 23rd, he personally came to Harlem with 20 heavily armed men. His plan: find Bumpy Johnson and kill him face to face. End this war by cutting off the head. Intelligence about Schultz's movements reached Bumpy within minutes. He had sources everywhere: bartenders, cab drivers, even cops on his payroll. The final showdown was coming. Both men knew it. The whole underworld was watching. What nobody expected was who would actually end this war. The phone call, September 23, 1935, 11:30 p.m. Schultz's convoy was rolling through Harlem, hunting for Bumpy. They didn't know that Bumpy had already chosen the battlefield, a warehouse where he'd positioned his men to create a perfect kill zone. 43 armed men were about to collide in a residential neighborhood. People were going to die, lots of people. But at 11:47 p.m., Schultz's convoy stopped. Not because they spotted the ambush. Not because police intervened. They stopped because Schultz got a phone call from Lucky Luciano. Lucky Luciano was the most powerful mobster in America. He'd organized the Italian, Jewish, and Irish gangs into one coordinated network called the National Crime Syndicate. He was, theoretically, Dutch Schultz's ally. But Luciano had a big problem. Federal prosecutor Thomas Dewey was building cases against the entire mob. All the violence in Harlem was drawing exactly the kind of attention that helped prosecutors. Every newspaper story about gangland shootings made it easier for Dewey to argue that organized crime needed to be destroyed. Worse, Luciano had learned that Schultz was planning to assassinate Thomas Dewey, to actually murder a federal prosecutor. That was insane. If Dewey got killed, the federal government would unleash hell on every mobster in America. The smart move was to lay low and cooperate just enough to seem reasonable. But Schultz didn't think that way. He solved every problem with violence, and that made him too dangerous to his own allies. The phone call lasted less than 2 minutes. Luciano didn't make threats. He just explained reality. The commission has made a decision. You're done with Harlem, pull out, make peace. This war ends tonight. When a mobster says the commission has made a decision, it means comply or die. Schultz understood. He gave the order. The convoy turned around. The men stood down. At the warehouse, Bumpy watched through a window as Schultz's convoy approached, stopped, then retreated. He didn't know why yet, but he recognized opportunity when he saw it. The next morning, Schultz's men started quietly leaving Harlem. Banks closed. Enforcers disappeared. Within 3 days, most of Schultz's Harlem operation was gone. Not because Bumpy defeated him in battle, though he'd fought him to a draw, but because Schultz's own allies decided he was too dangerous to keep around. Dutch Schultz's end, October 23, 1935. Just over a month after the slap, Dutch Schultz walked into the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey, for a meeting with his closest guys, Lulu Rosenkrantz, Abe Landau, and his accountant Otto Berman. At 10:15 p.m., 2 men walked in, Charles the Bug Workman and Emmanuel Mendy Weiss, professional killers sent by Murder, Inc., the mob's enforcement arm. They opened fire. All 4 men got hit multiple times. Schultz, shot in the bathroom, staggered back into the restaurant and collapsed. He survived for 22 more hours, delirious with fever, rambling about hidden treasure and old enemies. He died on October 24th at 8:35 p.m. He was 33 years old. The commission ordered his death for several reasons. His plan to kill Dewey was too risky. His violent instability made him unpredictable. But the trigger, the thing that made them decide, now's the time, was his failure in Harlem. When a mob boss can't control his territory and starts losing to independent operators, he becomes a liability. By refusing to accept the slap, by fighting back, Bumpy Johnson set in motion the chain of events that killed one of America's most powerful gangsters. What happened to Bumpy with Schultz dead? Harlem's numbers operation stabilized under black control. Bumpy negotiated directly with the Italian mafia, not as an employee, but as an equal controlling his own territory. Harlem stayed independent, though they paid a percentage to the mob families as tribute. It wasn't complete freedom, but it was sustainable. For the next 15 years, Bumpy Johnson ran Harlem's underworld. He got arrested multiple times and served 2 long prison sentences, including time on Alcatraz from 1954 to 1963. But he always came back to power. His reputation protected him. His intelligence kept him ahead of rivals. His careful work with the community, funding youth programs, helping families in need, keeping order, made him complicated. People feared him and respected him at the same time. In the 1960s, he became friends with Malcolm X, the young civil rights leader, respected Bumpy's dignity and his refusal to bow to white authority, even though Malcolm rejected the criminal lifestyle. Bumpy survived into the late 1960s, but by then the world had changed. The heroin epidemic was destroying Harlem. Younger, more violent criminals were taking over. Bumpy represented old-school gangster honor in a world that didn't care about honor anymore. On July 7, 1968, Bumpy Johnson had a massive heart attack while eating dinner at a restaurant in Harlem. He was 62. His last meal was fried chicken, collard greens, and cornbread. Over 1,000 people came to his funeral. Old gangsters stood next to ministers, politicians, and regular Harlem residents. Everyone had a Bumpy story. How he helped their family, how he kept the neighborhood safe, how he represented something important. Frank Lucas, a young hustler who'd attached himself to Bumpy in the 60s, walked into the funeral carrying a briefcase with $100,000 cash. It was a gesture of respect, showing how much Bumpy meant to the underworld. The newspapers wrote surprisingly respectful obituaries. Even cops admitted off the record that he maintained order and prevented worse criminals from taking over. But what none of those obituaries mentioned was the night in September 1935 when Bumpy Johnson got slapped, and everything changed. Why this story matters: look, Bumpy Johnson was a criminal. He broke laws, corrupted officials, and caused real suffering. We shouldn't pretend otherwise. But you can't understand his story without understanding the world he lived in. Bumpy grew up in an America that systematically denied black people any path to legitimate power or wealth. Harlem in the 1930s had poverty rates above 40%. Unemployment among black men hit 60% during the Depression. The legal economy,